This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Did you attend last year's ASA conference? If you're a member of ASA, you can register for the conference and access recordings of all the talks and panels online. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a collection of scholarly books focused on animal studies. Regular listeners will know that we've featured lots of books in this series in the past, and I'm pleased to say that one of the books is on my list for a future episode. That's 2021's Animal Welfare in China, Culture, Politics and Crisis by Peter J. Lee. Now, I've been planning to talk to today's guest for a long time. We got talking back in 2020 after a session in the Animals, Climate Change and Global Health webinar series. By the way, you can watch these back if you visit animalsclimatehealth.com. Lots of the speakers will be familiar to regular listeners of Knowing Animals, and I chaired a panel. Today's guest is Professor Gregory Tague. Gregory is a professor in the Department of Literature, Writing and Publishing and the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at St. Francis College in New York. He's the founder of ASEBL Journal, that's the journal of the Association for the Study of Ethical Behaviour in Evolutionary Biology and Literature, and of Literary Veganism, an online journal. He's also the author or editor of over a dozen books, including 2016's Evolution and Human Culture and 2018's Art and Adaptability. Today, however, we're going to talk about his 2020 book, An Ape Ethic and the Question of Personhood, which was published by Lexington Books. Welcome to the podcast, Gregory.
Thank you, Dr. Milburn, Josh Milburn, for having me.
So can you start by telling me what led you to work on this topic?
Yes, that's a great question. I'll try to keep it brief because, of course, the answer is very long. But as you may know, my PhD is in literary studies. I was especially interested in the English novel. And in working on my first and then second monograph, which dealt with the English novel, I was interested in the notion of character, mostly from a philosophical perspective. But at some point I said, well, maybe I should try to understand how the brain works. And in the process of reading and researching about the brain, inevitably I had to read about evolutionary studies. And that led me down a path from which I have not turned back. In fact, I haven't really written anything in terms of literary studies in years. All these other books have focused on what I call evolutionary studies. So that's one of the main things that brought me up to where I am now. I should mention, in terms of An Ape Ethic specifically, that I was invited to a 3-day working panel at the Modern Language Association here in New York. And that panel was on something called nonhuman forms. And I thought, oh, well, I know what people are going to be doing because they're all literary scholars and they'll be doing things in deconstruction and whatnot. I said, it might be interesting if I did something a little different. So I focused on, they're really not non-human forms, but I was focusing on the Neanderthals and other early hominin species. And then for some reason, my path right after that workshop crossed Gary Shapiro. Gary Shapiro was a primatologist and the founder of the Orangutan Republic Foundation. And I was looking for some kind of small organization to be a part of. I gravitated to Jane Goodall's, but it's just so big, I thought maybe I'd get lost. So Gary and I started to get to know each other. And as it turns out, this paper that I wrote for the MLA, I thought, well, maybe he and I could work on a book together. And that's exactly what happened. We co-authored essentially a book that consisted of an academic chapter by me on some aspect of primate intelligence or cognition or social behavior. And then in between, there would be a chapter from Gary that was more narrative about his experiences in Borneo in the 1970s working with Birute Galdikas. And you would think that a publisher would want a book like that, because some of them say we want hybrid books and one. No one wanted it. So then we decided, we're still on excellent terms, but we decided to abandon the co-author book and then just pursue our own. So that's where this book, An Ape Ethic and the Question of Personhood, came out of. And I should mention that the book is dedicated to Gary Shapiro.
So let's get to the bottom of some of the concepts that you use in this book. And indeed, let's start with what I think is the most central one. Who or what do you mean by apes? And why do you focus on apes in this book?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Because I know a lot of people, the book deals with personhood in terms of ecosystem engineering. And a lot of people might say, well, okay, beavers are ecosystem engineers. Worms, Charles Darwin wrote a whole book about worms, pretty much, to say nothing of the barnacles. So, why apes? I don't know that I really have to defend that. And I'm not saying that your question is asking me to defend that. It's dangerous in a way what I did, because it makes it seem like, well, apes are these kinds of prestige species. But I don't really believe that, because I don't believe in a hierarchy in terms of the evolutionary things. It's a plane, it's a plateau. And all these organisms, whether it's a bacteria, a fungi, a moss, or a whale, each one plays a part in the biosphere. It just happens that I decided to write about apes, and apes meaning great apes. We are great apes. But I do talk about us in the book, and I say that, we're not really the good ecosystem engineers. The great apes are the ones who are.
So by great apes, you mean orangutans, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, is that correct? Plus humans, of course.
Yes, yes.
So the other concepts you look towards, or perhaps the three central concepts that you use to justify the claims that you make about apes, are the ideas of moral individualism, ecosystem engineering, which you've already mentioned, and this idea of an ape ethic or an ape land ethic. So I realise that these are three big questions, but could you introduce us to these ideas as well?
When we talk about the ape and the environment, the two are inseparable. For humans, it is separate. We have separated ourselves from the environment. That's not the case with great apes. There's this kind of mutualism that succeeds over dualism. We don't have, we separated ourselves. We live in houses and all this other stuff. In terms of the ecosystem engineering, that's not a process that necessarily has to be conscious. Clive Jones is one of the people who originated this idea. What he said, he really looks at the net result. So the net result of what great apes do is that it benefits the ecosystem through their movements, through their eco-psychology, as opposed to what humans do. I mean, we go in and we ravage rainforests. In terms of the moral individualism, I know that's a little tricky. And I suppose what I was trying to do there in the book was move away from, not completely, but move away from some of these Kantian notions that focus more on rationality, because that helps elevate humans. This is not to say that great apes are not rational. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the similarities between humans and apes. But I think if there's one take-home point from this podcast that people might be interested in, is that the book is really about the differences between great apes and humans. And some things that we read, I mean, there was a great book that came out a few years ago. You contributed to that book, didn't you? That book that was put together as the philosopher's brief as part of Stephen Wise's Non-Human Rights Project?
Yes, I know the book you mean. The philosopher's brief, published by Routledge in 2019, I think. I didn't contribute to it, though.
Yes, it's called Chimpanzee Rights. And believe me, that book is great. I love that book. I got a lot of inspiration out of it. But for instance, there too, the emphasis seems to be on, let's give personhood to great apes, mostly because of the rational components and how much they are like humans. But let's face it, they're not. They're not humans, and the differences are significant. They've been living in and maintaining their own lands for millennia. So that's where the kind of land ethic comes from. And I borrow that from Aldo Leopold, who wrote a book that was published in 1949, where he places more emphasis on the integrity of the land and not the economy of the land.
Well, let's explore this idea of the land ethic a little bit. It seems like what you're saying is that we know Leopold's land ethic, which is a human land ethic, but in this book you're arguing that there is a specific ape ethic and that they interact with the land in a distinctively ethical way, but in a way that is distinctively their own. So could you introduce us to this idea of an ape ethic?
Yes, and it may have something to do with what's called eco-psychology. So when Leopold was talking about the land ethic, he was saying that, well, we should conserve the lands, we should preserve the lands, and we shouldn't necessarily see them as a means to increase our economic gains. But of course, apes won't even think that way. I mean, their ethic, if that's the word, and I use the word ethic as I use the word morals meaning something that would be customs, agreed upon customs, and an ethic might be more of a personal feeling about those customs. I mean, for the apes, because they are literally inseparable from the land, they don't have to make that kind of distinction between a land economy and a land ethic. I'm the one who's saying and applying the notion of the land ethic and the ape ethic to the apes. I mean, they may not know that. They don't have to know that. It's just something they do. James Lovelock in 1979, and he's still alive, put forth this theory about Gaia and the Earth as this kind of self-regulating organism. And, well, that's what it kind of looks like. And how do we know that? Because of the disruptions that humans have made, especially to the oceans and the rainforests, which are the kinds of bellows that help keep the atmosphere clear. So the ape land ethic is just part of how they adapted to the rainforest. And they've been there much longer than we have. I mean, Homo erectus was around a lot longer than anatomically modern humans. I mean, it used to be 250,000 years that we were around. That's been pushed back a little in the last few years. I mean, Homo erectus was more of a hunter-gatherer, and there still are hunter-gatherer societies, and they do a better job at maintaining the lands in which they live than we do. So the ape ethic is just a matter of how they've adapted to their environs, and they keep them sustainable.
I see. So, and this is an issue that you return to again and again in the book. You're not necessarily committed to the claim that apes are moral agents in the way that you or I are. They don't necessarily reflect upon good and evil or right and wrong. You just don't see that as necessary for understanding them as having an ethic.
Well, that's true, but they do function quite a bit in social groups. And, I might put the word social in quotation marks depending upon the type of ape. So the social dynamic of gorillas and mountain gorillas is very different from the social dynamic of chimpanzees, which is very different from the social dynamic of bonobos or orangutans. But the fact is, and I cite a ton, as you probably know, a ton of material in the book from scientists. I'm not a scientist, but I know how to read. And all these apes have, we all derive from a common ancestor. So they function socially. And part of the ape ethic that I'm talking about is that their social function, whether it's the mother-infant dyad or the fission-fusion group of the chimpanzee, that kind of group dynamic, that social function, that ethic, has a lot to do with their feeding processes. And those feeding processes, for the most part, sustain the forest. I say for the most part because it's probably common knowledge now, maybe not, but because of the encroachment by humans on huge areas of land in Africa and the Amazon and in Indonesia, these forests are shrinking. And it's putting pressure not just on the apes, but other species with whom they have to cohabit. They adapted together, and now they have to learn new forms of adaptation.
So, what's the practical output here? I know that one of your proposals is a kind of policy proposal about giving great apes their own space.
Yes, yes. And this is not necessarily anything new. E.O. Wilson talks about half Earth, and there are other proposals. We saw recently a lot of countries are saying that we should put aside 30%. My claim is to grant simian sovereignty to great apes. This would mean that vast tracts of tropical forest would be left under their stewardship, perhaps partly in line with E.O. Wilson's notion of setting aside large portions of the earth to rewild. For millions of years, apes have maintained forests to promote seed dispersal, tree growth, and hence biodiversity, rather than focusing on human-ape cognitive and behavioral similarities, which, however, like others I indeed cover in my book, I emphasize differences in morphology and physiology. For instance, apes are the good ecosystem engineers, not humans. I mean, what good will it do us if we develop a solar-powered tractor, or bulldozer, I should say, that's going to raise lands? What good is it going to do us if we develop a vaccine that helps cows not emit methane? All right, well, we'll be able to have the meat, but we still have to put them somewhere and cut down forests. As is well known, I mean, many individuals and corporations have persistently encroached on ape dominions to log, mine, farm, thus diminishing and degrading habitats that rightfully belong to apes. Non-human primates sustain forest biomes, which in turn aid Earth's atmospheric and oceanic self-regulating system known as Gaia from James Lovelock. So, I mean, that might be it kind of in a nutshell.
Yes. Well, one of the worries I've come across recently about focusing on apes, well, I suppose there's actually a few different worries that we might have. One you've already touched upon. You don't want to assert or reify some great hierarchy of being. You and I don't see apes at the top of some non human hierarchy. But another worry about simian sovereignty or the kind of half Earth proposals that you were just talking about is the worry that we might leave some people behind, that is, humans. We're talking here about ecosystems in Central Africa or in Indonesia. We're not talking about ecosystems where you and I reside in Western Europe or North America. So, do you think there might be worries about focusing on apes because of these interhuman reasons, as well as because of concern for other animals?
Yes, absolutely. I do touch on this a little in the book. People like Sue Donaldson, Will Klamaika, Ava Mayer have talked about this sort of cohabiting spaces. So whether it's an airport in Europe that wants to expand, well, how can we do that, but yet let the birds that live in the swamp area there stay, or how do we work with them? And it's the same thing with these areas in Africa and Indonesia. If I can mention him again, Gary Shapiro and his organization, and he's not the only one, his organization, the Orangutan Republic Foundation, works with the local people who live with the orangutans. And, they want to do things like these are not the corporations. These are the people, the ones that you're talking about, the real people, not the corporations where the guys are sitting in suits, in buildings in Manhattan, the people on the ground. So how do we make decisions to help them maintain their livelihood, but yet not kill an orangutan who's coming in and stealing his crops? So those are real concerns. And unfortunately, my book is not a blueprint. It's more theoretical, but there are people who, thank goodness, have their hands in the dirt and are trying to solve these very issues you're talking about.
Good. And it does seem like there's another practical proposal here, which is a hope that we as humans can learn something from the apes as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I mean, let's face it, we just don't get it, and we keep having these summits about climate change and diet changes and lifestyle changes, and then we fall back into the same habit. Now, we derive from a common ancestor. Believe me, I'm not saying the apes are the greatest. They love to eat. They'll eat as much as they possibly can, so there's that consuming instinct. It just so happens that there were 8 billion of us, and we consume all kinds of products. So I don't know what the answer, and I'm as guilty as this as anyone, but there may be something we could learn from other species. And just to be fair, in the book, I do talk about other species. I know Arctic fox comes up quite a bit as well as a kind of little ecosystem engineer, as well as the beavers and others. I don't know what the answer is, but yes.
So is the hope that perhaps, just as you're extending this notion to great apes now, in the future others might extend the argument to other ecosystem engineers? Or do you think there's something particular about great apes?
Well, the thing in particular about them is that they're our nearest living extant cousins. So some of the things we do, killing a whole family to get a baby and then traffic that, killing a mountain gorilla and cutting his hands off because someone in some country thinks that, that's going to give that person some special powers. I mean, that's hurting, harming things is not the way to go. So I don't talk about it in this book, but clearly education, awareness, public awareness campaigns, things like that could help to make us a little better. And I'm not putting myself on a pedestal, believe me, but we could try to be a little better.
Now, before I move on to our regular questions, let me point towards something you've already mentioned, which is how incredibly interdisciplinary this project is. As you say, your background is in literature, but this isn't a work of literary studies. So what kind of challenges do you encounter doing this kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work? And the reason I ask is that I think animal studies very naturally gravitate towards the interdisciplinary. I, as a philosopher / political theorist, need to be aware of work in the social sciences, in biology, in history, in a lot of areas that aren't necessarily in the departments that I sit in order to do the kind of work that I want to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And as I said in the beginning, this sort of happened by accident. I thought that my career, I'm retiring this year, would end as it began. And I would write books about, D.H. Lawrence. He was the subject of my dissertation and kind of central to some early work I had done. But I gravitated away from that, as I mentioned, because I was more interested in character and the brain. That led to evolutionary studies. And it's been a challenge, yes. But if someone wants to do this, he, she, they can. All you have to do is read a lot. Read a lot and read as much as you possibly can. But, and it's not just reading. Reading a lot, but also watching YouTube videos if you're interested in any particular species, listening to other people talk. But it can be done. And yeah, I know that word interdisciplinary is tossed around a little bit indiscriminately. I don't even know if I'm a true interdisciplinarian. I might be more of a multidisciplinarian. Interdisciplinary is difficult.
Yes, certainly. And I agree about it being difficult to pin down. I'm never quite sure what counts as interdisciplinary. All I know is that I and a lot of other animal studies people don't fit into neat silos. We cover a lot of ground that finds a more natural home in departments that we don't sit in our own institutions, in our own universities. So let me move on to our regular questions. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
No, I thought about this question, but it's also a great question. With me, it may not have been pro-animal scholarship. When I was a kid in the 1960s, I was very interested in science, and I read books like Microbe Hunters. I read authors like George Gamow. Then in the 70s, I read Lewis Thomas, The Lies of a Cell. But it's interesting. The book that really turned me somehow, and I never forgot about it, and I've read it and reread it several times, Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And Annie Dillard's not a scientist, but she has that kind of methodology about her writing, at least in that book, where she examines the natural world very carefully and respects it for what it is. That was definitely a turning point for me.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, those two would not have been scholarship per se. I wrote creatively about nature and natural themes. When I was a child, I was lucky in the 1960s, even though we were born and raised in Brooklyn, for long periods of the summer, our parents would take us up to this place we called the country house. And it had running water and electricity, and that's it. It had a gas-powered stove. So we spent most of our time outside. I mean, outside, we would climb trees, we'd build tree houses, play in the dirt. So I think that had a great influence on me, and some of the early things I wrote were very creative and dealt with those experiences. I would have to say this book, An Ape Ethic, was probably the first item that dealt with animal studies.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So some years ago, I had read a book by, I forget their full names, Best and Anthony Nacella, called Terrorists or Freedom Fighters. And that really opened my eyes. But they're more in critical animal studies. I mean, other people I had read and who had a huge impact on me would include, of course, Jane Goodall, Franz de Waal. Franz de Waal, I've read almost all of his books, and I've had the luck to hear him speak in person several times. But, there are a host of other people as well. Louise Barrett, Kristen Andrews. I've read some of your work.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think they have to be vocal. So the kinds of work that you do, publishing and speaking engagements, getting out there, trying to get the word out, helping people understand, well, as I said earlier, public awareness. There seems to be this big distrust of science or anti-intellectualism. I see that quite often in this country. I hate to say it, but I see it reflected in some members of my family. So, that cognitive dissonance and what might even be ethical dissonance, it has to be not with judgment and not with indoctrination. But, if we just can be a little more vocal more often, then maybe some people will come around and see.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
It might have something to do with what we talked about earlier, helping people understand that it's not so much a hierarchy, but it's just this kind of level plane. And each species is unique. And I don't know, this might get some flack, I don't know that anyone is necessarily exceptional. I know humans like to think we're exceptional. But, we're all unique, and we evolved and adapted and evolved adaptations in a way to fit in a certain kind of environment. So, if we can break that hierarchical thinking that goes back, at least to the 18th century with the Great Chain of Being, or what was Aristotle the one that came up with that? It's still there.
Now, I know you said you're retiring this year, but I also know that you have more work forthcoming. So what are you working on next?
Well, I have, this one's really going to get me in trouble. I have a book coming out with the Rutledge Studies in Food, Society, and the Environment called The Vegan Evolution. That should be out in May, or before then, I hope, because I tend to work very quickly. I also work on that journal you had mentioned, Literary Veganism, if anyone's interested. You don't have to be a vegan. It's just writing by, for, and about vegans. Most of the people who've contributed to that journal are not vegans. It's just writing that's animal and environmentally friendly. And, in terms of retiring, I don't know. I want to do something else, of course, but we're moving out of New York. That's going to be the main driver behind this retirement.
How can people find out more about your work?
Well, I do have a Google site, and I don't know if there's a way for you to post that somewhere, and I'm not even sure if you have that.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to share that.
Okay, I'll have to send that to you. But if people put into Google G, as in Gregory, F as in Frank, Tague, Tague, that site should come up.
Thanks, Gregory, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.